Hey, Stewart's Chapel, this is Brother Don Pierson, Don Counts, and we're at the Fogs again. And I bet you're getting tired of looking at this jacket. I'm about ready to take it off too. It's hot. And this is Tuesday's devotion, and we're in Luke 18. And I want to talk about a parable that some say it was actually so real that it happened all the time, at least in the day of Jesus. I got a feeling it still happens pretty regular today too. We're talking about legalism and how it creeps in. It looks clean. It looks very, very pure, religious-wise. It takes many, many captive. It secretly comes in like a wolf in sheep clothing, and it destroys. It destroys the person, by the way. So we're in Luke 18, verse 9 and following. It's one of my favorite scripture. It deals a lot with prayer. I don't want to really deal with it in relationship to prayer. I want to stay true to our focus. And Jesus' constant purpose of shining light on the legalists. Also, he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves. In other words, he's talking directly to them. They trusted in themselves that they were what? Righteous. And everybody else wasn't. And it even says that they were righteous and they despised others. They had it all figured out. They were the teachers. They were the masters. They were the only true preachers, and all other preachers were not the right preachers. In fact, they would make that known to their little flocks, that all the other ones were leading them astray. The problem was they're the ones that Jesus says are leading them astray. Verse 10. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee. That's that self-righteous, legalistic person who despised others. And the tax collector or the publican or the sinner. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men. Can you imagine? Most legalists today would not pray that. They just preach it. Or they have those conversations with individuals in private homes. I'm not like other men. I'm not an extortioner. I'm not unjust. I'm not an adulterer. Or even like this sinner, the publican, the tax collector. Oh, I can prove it to you, Lord. I fast twice a week, every week. I give tithes of all that I possess. That's it. It's not that there's not more. I guarantee it there's more. I dress right, Lord. I have respect for your house. I preach from the right book. I make sure that my wife is fully in submission and she knows who the head is. I'm being facetious, by the way, if you haven't figured that out. But there's more truth in that than you may realize. But either way, God doesn't write down the rest of his prayer because God has heard it many, many times. This individual really is not talking to God. He's trying to educate God. He's just trying to remind God what a mighty fine man he is. Well, the tax collector, the sinner, the publican, he doesn't stand near. He stands afar off. He doesn't so much as raise his eyes to heaven. He beats his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. You see, the Pharisee talks about mercy, but they really don't believe they need much. Jesus said, I tell you, this man, this publican, this sinner, the one who doesn't seem to do anything right, he will go down to his house justified. rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now you need to understand, this Pharisee, this guy is here 3 times a day. Every time the call of prayer went off, he was there. Not 3 times a week, 3 times a day. This guy, he looks religious. He looks godly to everybody. Everybody is deceived but Jesus. He seems to do everything right. Some time ago, a preacher said to me, he said, you know what? Can you imagine what it would be like to have a church full of Pharisees? I laughed because I thought, I've been there. I've been in a church full of Pharisees before. He says, can you imagine though? Your offerings would always be overflowing. There would be tithes. Everybody would be tithing. There would be more than enough. They would be there. You would never have to preach about them forsaking the gathering of themselves together because they would never miss. In fact, they would be there every time it opened. You could count on them. And then he said, but you know what? You would have a church full of people going to hell. And they wouldn't even know it. And then I stopped smiling because he's exactly right. A church full of Pharisees may look good for the bank book, may look good for the seats. But Pharisees were Jesus' enemy. They're an enemy to the gospel. I'm going to end this one with this. My son sent this to me. I don't know what you think or your opinion of Martin Luther King Jr., but this is from one of his sermons. It's a quote. Let me read it to you. And so it boils down that we are sinners in need of God's redemptive power. We know truth, and yet we lie. We know how to be just, and yet we are unjust. We know how to live our lives on the plane of love, and yet we hate. Or we are unfaithful to those we should be faithful to. We stand amid the high road, and yet we deliberately choose the low road. We know the ways of peace, and yet we go to war. And when we come to see ourselves, we discover that all of us are sinners. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. There's no point in pushing it out here saying, well, I don't fit into that category. For sin takes so many areas. And not only we often see these things that are so glaring and we think they are the only sins. Getting drunk or indulging in tragic lust or going downtown, robbing a bank and stealing a lot of money. That's not the only sin. I've seen people who would never rob a bank, but how many have they robbed of their good names? I've seen people who were so good that they would never do anything in terms of stealing from their neighbors of materials good, but they'll get on the telephone and gossip about them and spread evil rumors about them. All of that is sin. I've seen people who would say I don't do anything, I don't drink, I don't do this, I don't do that. And then they end up their lives bogged down in a negative because the Christian ethics is never a bundle of do's nots. It's a bushel of do's. Whenever I hear people talking about what they don't do, I wonder, what do they do? It's always an affirmative. And there is never a time when the individual, even in his moment of highest ethical achievement, doesn't experience this disinterrogation, this tragic annihilation from God. Every man experiences it. And that is why the saint always recognizes that he's a sinner. And the worst sinner in the world is the man who feels that he isn't a sinner. Let me say that again. The worst sinner in the world is the man who feels that he isn't a sinner. That is the point at which he's the greatest sinner. So that in our own personal lives, as we look at ourselves, as we look at the personal dimensions of our everyday living, we discover this dimension of sin. And there is something about it that causes us to know that as we look down into the deepest resources of our souls, that we are in eternal revolt against God. Let me bring this back, this final quote, and it is in relationship to the scripture that we read of this Pharisee who dares looks at God and says to God, I'm not like other men. This is what Martin Luther said. I don't know about you, but when I look at myself hard enough and deep enough and go on back from my public self to my private self, I don't feel like crying out with the Pharisee, I thank thee, God, that I'm not like other men. But I find myself saying, Lord, be merciful unto me, a sinner. There is that dimension which runs the gamut of human life, so that man in his personal experiences discovers his tragic dimension and his awful tendency of sin. The Pharisee is so busy looking at what others are doing or don't doing that they fail to look deep at themselves. So they live a life of looking at the externals instead of looking at the internal. Love you, Sears Chapel.